A man who carries the most weight is rarely the one making the most noise. Piers Atchison had understood this since he was 19 years old, watching his father climb out of a frozen ditch on the outskirts of Sudbury at 6 in the morning without a word of complaint to anyone. That image had settled somewhere permanent in him, not as a wound but as a compass. He was 43 now, and he still got up before the sun. 14 years of early mornings in the boatyard on Lakeshore Road in Burlington. 14 years of cedar shavings and fiberglass dust and the particular cold that comes off Lake Ontario in November. The kind that finds every gap in your jacket and stays there. 14 years of building things by hand that were meant to last. Custom wooden sailboats, mostly. A few commission pieces for clients who understood what they were paying for, and a few who didn't, and Piers could always tell the difference within the first 10 minutes of a meeting. The ones who understood, he kept. The ones who didn't, he finished their boats anyway, to the same standard, and then politely never worked with them again. His wife, Renata, no, that name was taken. His wife, Sylvie, also taken. His wife, Odette Atchison, had different ideas about what a man like Piers should be. She said it the way people say things they have rehearsed so many times they no longer hear them. Not cruelly, exactly. Just with the flat efficiency of a person stating a fact they believe is obvious. They were standing in the kitchen of their house on Brant Street in Burlington, the one with the wraparound porch and the old maple in the front yard that dropped leaves on the neighbor's driveway every October without apology. Odette was dressed for the foundation gala at the Hamilton Convention Center. A silk wrap in burgundy, hairpinned, every detail calibrated. Behind her stood a man named Fletcher. No, that name was taken too. Behind her stood a man named Crispin Vane, 31, tall, in that studied way, the kind of tall that knows it is being noticed. His suit was Italian, and he wore it like a credential. Piers had just walked in from the boatyard. He set his keys on the hook beside the door, the same hook where Keys had lived in this house for 11 years. Odette turned from the mirror. Her gaze moved over him once, quickly, in the way you look at something you have already categorized and do not intend to reconsider. Piers. Her voice was even, almost kind, the way a sentence can sound kind while doing something that isn't. You're not coming tonight. I think we both know you wouldn't fit in with the bored crowd. Crispin understands that world. He belongs there. She adjusted her earring. I need someone at my side who elevates the room. Not someone who smells like wood shavings and lake water. The door to the garage closed behind them. Piers stood alone in the kitchen. The overhead light hummed. Outside, a streetcar somewhere on Brant moved past with its familiar rattle. Odette's perfume stayed behind, faint and expensive, already belonging to somewhere else. He had been with her for 12 years, married for 9, and that, he thought quietly, is what 9 years sounds like when they run out of room. He did not raise his voice, did not pace the kitchen, or put his fist through anything. There is a kind of man who is built solidly enough on the inside that contempt slides off without finding purchase. Piers was that kind of man, not by accident, but because he had spent a long time deciding what he was made of. He knew what was in the accounts. He knew what his name was attached to, quietly, in documents Odette had never once thought to look for. He walked upstairs, stood under the shower, until the cold from the boatyard left his shoulders, and then opened the wardrobe. The charcoal wool suit had been hanging there since August, dry cleaned and waiting, picked up from a tailor on John Street in downtown Hamilton without any particular explanation to anyone. His father's watch, the Omega Seamaster, with the cracked crystal that Piers had never repaired because he liked the crack, went on his wrist. He went to the garage, pulled the drop cloth off a 1967 Jaguar E-Type in British racing green that he had spent 4 years restoring in the space between everything else quietly, without telling anyone, because some things you build for yourself. Tonight, Piers Atchison was driving to the foundation gala alone, and the version of himself about to walk through those doors was not the one anyone in that ballroom was prepared for. If you have ever done the quiet work while someone nearby decided it made you small, stay here. Because what happened next in that Hamilton Convention Center is the kind of thing that changes a room's understanding of what it means to actually see a person. Odette Acheson had a way of introducing her husband at social events that told you everything about what she thought of him without saying anything directly unflattering. Piers is wonderfully dedicated. He builds boats, of all things. The pause she inserted after boats was doing considerable work. He's very content with his little operation down on Lakeshore. The word little was never an accident. Neither was content, which in that context meant has stopped reaching for anything. Psychologists call this benevolent condescension. You do not attack someone openly. You praise them carefully for qualities that conveniently keep them peripheral to the story you are constructing around yourself. The praise becomes the boundary. He's so grounded. Isn't it something, the way he's happy just doing what he does? A cage built out of compliments. She was not wrong about the dedication. She was thoroughly wrong about everything else. Odette had been at the foundation for 11 years. The Ontario Arts and Architecture Foundation was a mid-sized charitable organization based in Hamilton, with a board that included some of the heavier names in the province's development and cultural sectors. She had risen to executive director on genuine ability. Nobody who watched her work could doubt that. She was precise, persuasive, and had a talent for making donors feel that their money was going somewhere worth remembering. What she did not know was who had made it possible for that organization to survive the years it otherwise wouldn't have. Piers had met Lawrence Beaumont. No, Beaumont was close to Betrayal, which was taken. He had met Lawrence Doré at a fundraising dinner 7 years ago, the year Odette joined the foundation board. Lawrence was in his early 70s then, silver-haired, with the careful manners of a man who has had money long enough that he no longer needs to announce it. He had grown up in Hamilton's North End, in the same neighborhood as Piers's grandfather, and they had stood at the bar talking about the old streets for 45 minutes before either of them mentioned what they did for a living. Lawrence, it turned out, had built a significant portion of the commercial real estate that defined Hamilton's waterfront, and he had, over the previous 2 decades, quietly provided the financial backbone for 3 arts organizations in the region, including the foundation Odette would one day run. "Your grandfather was a good man," Lawrence had said, near the end of the evening. "He lent me money when nobody else in that neighborhood would. I never forgot it." He had looked at Piers with a directness that older men sometimes have, the look of someone who has been deciding things for a long time and has gotten efficient at it. "I'd like to bring you in on something. Not for public credit, just because I think you'd understand what it's for." Piers had understood. Over the years that followed, working through a private holding company structured by Lawrence's legal team, Piers had redirected capital from the boatyard, which had grown from a 2-man operation into a 10-person shop with an 8-month waiting list and an international reputation for a particular style of cold-water sailboat, into a funding structure that provided the foundation with reliable operational reserves during 3 separate fiscal crises, including one in 2019 that would have effectively ended the organization without the intervention. Odette had led the foundation through all 3 crises. She had been credited with the recovery each time. She was, by any reasonable measure, skilled at what she did. But the ground beneath her had been prepared and held steady by the man she introduced at parties, with that particular pause. She had never asked. She had never looked. 2 days before the foundation gala, Piers came home early. He came in through the side entrance, heard Odette's voice through the half-open door of the study, low, businesslike, the tone she used when she was certain of something. "Don't worry, Crispin." A pause. "The filing is straightforward. The boatyard is the main asset. He's been treating it like a personal project for so long he doesn't understand what it's actually worth. Once the separation goes through, Between the business valuation and the property, we'll have enough to get the Oakville house and start properly. Piers stood in the hallway for a moment. Not from shock, precisely. More from the cold, clear sensation of a suspicion that has been living in the peripheral vision, finally stepping directly into the light. She hadn't been drifting, he understood. She had been planning. He thought about Odette for a long time in that hallway. Not with anger, though anger would have been understandable. With a kind of sorrow that is specific to moments when you understand that someone you loved had, somewhere along the way, stopped being afraid of losing you and started calculating what you were worth to take. Psychologists describe something called scarcity mindset, a cognitive pattern shaped by the experience of not having enough, which can harden over time from a survival skill into a way of seeing all relationships as fundamentally transactional. Odette had grown up in a household that was always 2 paychecks from real difficulty. Her drive had come from that. Her clarity, her relentlessness, the precision with which she built her professional life, all of it traced back to that fear which had once been a source of strength, but fear maintained long enough begins to distort. It starts turning the people who love you quietly into line items. He walked out to the garage and sat at his workbench for a long time, not planning anything, just becoming clear. That evening, he drove to the north end of the city, to the address of a woman named Georgette. That name was taken. To the address of a woman named Miriam, also taken. To the address of a woman named Winifred Dow, who was 81 years old and had called the week before about a grinding sound in the outboard motor on her dock boat, a 14-foot aluminum runabout she had owned since 1993 and refused to replace. He bled the fuel line and cleaned the carburetor while she sat in a lawn chair on the dock and told him about her son's new teaching position in Kamloops. When he finished and she reached for her wallet, he shook his head. Keep it. On the drive back, he left an envelope in the donation box at St. Matthew's Anglican on Catherine Street. For the Family Assistance Fund. No name, no note. He did these things the way he always did them, without ceremony, without the particular self-satisfaction that can creep into generosity when it starts needing to be witnessed. That night, looking at the charcoal suit in the wardrobe, he thought about his father and the frozen ditch outside Sudbury and what it meant to do what needed doing without requiring an audience. He picked up his phone and texted Lawrence. "I'll be there, Friday, save me a chair." The reply came quickly. "Already done. It's been there a while." The Hamilton Convention Center on King Street East has a way of organizing people. The ballroom on the second floor, with its high ceilings and the view of the escarpment to the south, has hosted enough significant evenings in this city that it carries its own kind of gravity. Some people walk in and feel the room lift them. Others walk in calculating how they appear within it. Odette arrived at 7:30 with Crispin at her side. The burgundy silk, the composed authority of a woman who has practiced entering important rooms for years. Crispin was half a step behind her in a way that communicated exactly what it was intended to communicate while maintaining enough distance to leave the formal question open. She worked the room with skill. She always did. Warm handshakes, the right laugh at the right moment, the practiced social performance of someone who has studied influence and applies it consciously. When a board member's wife named, a woman named Patricia asked after Piers, Odette tilted her head with just the right degree of warm regret. He had a commitment at the boatyard. You know how he is. He loves that place. A gentle laugh. I brought someone who speaks this language a little more fluently. At a nearby table, one of the younger board members leaned toward a colleague. Wasn't her husband invited? The colleague shrugged. She said something about him being tied up, or not being much for these events. One of those. Patricia's smile did not quite reach her eyes. Dinner was served at 8. At the head table, one chair sat empty with a card on it. Lawrence Doré, when someone asked, simply nodded and said nothing further. At 8:30, Lawrence rose from his seat and approached the podium. The room settled the way it does for men who have never needed to raise their voice. "Good evening." He adjusted the microphone once. "Before the formal program, I want to take a moment for something that is long overdue. A recognition that should have been made publicly some time ago, and wasn't, because the person it concerns specifically asked me not to." He paused. "I have known this man since he was a boy. I knew his grandfather, and I can tell you with some certainty that what he has done for this organization and for this city is the kind of thing that very rarely gets talked about because the person doing it has no interest in talking about it." He looked up. "I'd like to invite Piers Atchison to the stage." The room went quiet in a particular way. 3 full seconds of genuine silence before heads began to turn. From the back of the ballroom, moving through the space between tables with the unhurried ease of a man who has nowhere he needs to rush, came a figure in a charcoal wool suit. No cape, no cane. Just a man who looked, in that moment, like exactly what he was. Someone who had been in the room the whole time, just not in the way anyone had noticed. Odette's hand went still on her water glass. Crispin leaned toward her. "Is that—" "Don't," she said. Piers reached the stage. He and Lawrence shook hands the way men do when they have known each other long enough that the handshake means something actual. Then Piers stepped to the microphone. He looked out at the room. Let it settle. He was in no hurry. "My name is Piers Atchison. I build boats on Lakeshore Road in Burlington. Most days I have sawdust on my jacket and smell like fiberglass resin and Lake Ontario. I say that not as an apology, just as context. A few warm sounds from the room, the kind that come from recognition, not performance. 7 years ago, Lawrence brought me into a funding arrangement that I am ready to speak about publicly for the first time tonight. The Ontario Arts and Architecture Foundation has faced 3 significant financial crises in the last decade. During each of those crises, operational reserves held through a private structure, funded through my own capital, provided the bridge that kept this organization in operation." He paused. "The total invested over that period is just over $14 million. The murmuring in the room changed register. I did not do this for recognition. I did it because I believed in what this organization does, and because I understood what it would mean to the people who depend on it if it closed." He looked, briefly and directly, toward Odette's table. "I'm sharing it tonight because certain recent developments have made continued privacy no longer appropriate." He stepped back from the microphone for a moment, then returned. "I'm also announcing the establishment of the Atchison Doré Trades Bursary in partnership with Lawrence, supporting young people from Hamilton's North End and the Barton Street corridor in pursuing skilled trades certification. My grandfather was a tradesman. Lawrence grew up 2 streets from where my grandfather worked. This city built both of them, and both of them believed you give that back." He stepped away. The applause that followed began slowly and then built into something genuine. Several people were standing before they had consciously decided to. Lawrence was watching with the expression of a man who has waited a long time for a moment and is, now that it has arrived, in no hurry to look away from it. At her table, Odette sat very still. The internal story she had been running. "I built this," he was background, "I am the one who matters in this world we inhabit," had just been quietly and completely revised in front of every person she had spent 15 years building her professional identity beside. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance collapse. The instant when the narrative a person has been maintaining becomes so fundamentally incompatible with reality that the mind cannot hold both versions at once. It does not arrive as an explosion. It arrives as a kind of sudden cold, a restructuring, a moment in which you understand that the story you have been telling yourself about who you are and what you have built is missing a foundation you never thought to look for. "Did you know any of this?" Crispin said quietly. She did not answer. There was nothing to say. Piers walked to the head table and sat in the empty chair beside Lawrence, where he had, it turned out, always had a seat. What he said next, about the money that had been moved, about Crispin's involvement in certain irregularities in the Foundation's procurement accounts, and about something he had quietly done for Odette's mother that nobody in that room had known, is what brought the evening to a kind of stillness that nobody there would forget. There is a particular quiet that settles over a room after something real has happened. Not silence exactly. Conversations resumed. The catering staff moved between tables. Someone near the back was saying something about the quarterly giving report that no one was absorbing. But underneath all of it was a hush that hadn't existed an hour before. Everyone was processing the same event privately, behind the performance of ordinary behavior. Odette sat straight. Years of practiced composure held her upright. Beside her, Crispin refilled his wine glass. It was the second time in 20 minutes. His hand was not entirely steady. Across the room, Piers sat at the head table in quiet conversation with Lawrence. He was not looking at Odette. Somehow, the not looking was worse. Psychologists describe this as anticipated regret. Not pain from what has already been done to you, but from the sudden understanding of what you have done, yourself, and cannot undo. Odette's plans, the separation paperwork, the Oakville conversation, all of it still existed, but inside a context that had completely changed shape around it. She was the executive director of an organization in which her husband was the majority financial patron, and she had been preparing to take his assets in a divorce. She picked up her water glass, set it down without drinking. At 9:15, Lawrence returned to the podium. "I apologize for interrupting the evening a second time." He did not look particularly apologetic. There is a matter of administrative integrity the board has determined must be addressed tonight, in this room, rather than through a quiet memo that might be misunderstood. The projection screen behind him lit up. A spreadsheet, detailed, with line items that several board members leaned forward to read more carefully. Over the past 16 months, the Foundation experienced irregularities in contractor payments routed through an administrative account used primarily for event and communications procurement. A forensic audit completed 3 weeks ago by an external firm in Toronto traced approximately $340,000 in falsified invoices to the individual responsible for vendor management and executive scheduling. He looked up. That individual is Crispin Vane. The name landed the way names do when a room has been half expecting something without knowing it. Crispin's face moved through several expressions very quickly before settling into something fixed and doing a great deal of work to stay that way. His hand on the wine glass was not steady at all now. Heads turned. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness that makes a turn of the head feel like a verdict. Odette stared at him. This was not the same expression she had worn when Piers walked to the podium. That had been shock. This was something colder, the specific expression of a person who has just understood, in full, that the man she chose over her husband had been treating her, the entire time, as a useful door to walk through. This is what researchers describe when they discuss what is sometimes called the dark triad in practice: manipulation packaged inside social performance, polished enough to read as charm. Crispin had not chosen Odette because she was exceptional. He had chosen her because she ran an organization with procurement accounts he could access, and because her desire to be seen with someone who belonged at this level had made her, for a time, convenient. The board has referred its findings to the Hamilton Police Service and the appropriate provincial authorities, Lawrence said. Mr. Vane will address those findings through the proper legal process. He paused, but that is not the most important thing I wanted to say tonight. Near the side of the room, at one of the auxiliary tables, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap. Perhaps 65, a good dress carefully maintained. The face of a woman who had spent a lifetime carrying things without complaint and had gotten very good at making it look ordinary. Her name Marguerite. That name was taken. Her name was Heloise Fontaine, Odette's mother. She had raised Odette alone in a house on the east side of the city, working as a bookkeeper for 30 years, building a life with the particular discipline of someone who understands that everything you have can be taken, and so you hold onto it carefully. She was the source of everything that was best in Odette, and everything that had calcified into fear. 22 months ago, Heloise had received a diagnosis that her doctor delivered in the measured language of someone who has learned that gentleness and clarity are not opposites. Stage 2, moving toward 3. The treatment costs had grown past what her coverage handled, into a range that Heloise had told no one about, including Odette, because Heloise did not burden people. What Odette did not know was what her husband had done. Piers returned to the microphone. 19 months ago, through an anonymous patient fund established in coordination with Juravinsky Cancer Center at Hamilton Health Sciences, a series of directed contributions, totaling just under $280,000, covered the full treatment costs, specialist consultations, medication, and transportation for a patient receiving care there. He stopped for a moment. That patient was Heloise Fontaine, Odette's mother. The room went to a different quality of silence. I didn't tell anyone. I'm sharing it now because there are moments when the full truth is the only thing worth standing on, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. He looked across the room toward Odette. His voice did not waver. I paid for her mother's treatment while my wife was preparing documentation to claim my business assets in a separation filing. No one in that room reacted with triumph. They reacted with something quieter and more specifically human. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has written about what he calls moral elevation, the response we experience when we witness genuine virtue that has gone unacknowledged. A warmth in the chest, a tightness in the throat. It is one of the most distinctly human emotional responses, and it is involuntary. Every person in that ballroom felt some version of it. From her chair near the side wall, Heloise Fontaine stood up. She moved carefully through the tables and people stepped back without being asked, the way a room sometimes organizes itself around someone without knowing why. She walked to the stage. Piers came down the steps to meet her. She held him for a long moment. The microphone was still open. "Mon cher," she said quietly, "I have known since March. I was waiting for the right time to say it." She pulled back and looked at him. "Thank you. For everything you have never asked to be thanked for." He held her without saying anything. Which was, in that room, exactly right. Near the windows, a board member named, a man who was generally known in Hamilton's professional circles for a complete absence of visible emotion, appeared to be studying the floral centerpiece with unusual concentration. Odette was crying, not the composed kind, both hands over her face, shoulders moving. Everything she had spent years calibrating and maintaining, publicly, in that particular room had come apart. Beside her, Crispin Vane, $340,000 of fraud charges accumulating to his name, had nothing useful to contribute. The upgrade. The man who spoke this language more fluently. The statement piece. Comprehensively, quietly, and in front of everyone who mattered to her professionally, revealed. Later, near the exit to the parking garage, Crispin made an attempt at explanation. It was a short-term cash flow issue. I had a plan to put it back. A board member on her way out did not slow her pace. You were expensing client dinners at Ancaster Golf Club to a charitable organization. What plan? He had no answer. Piers found Odette near the lobby, composure rebuilt by force of habit, the way a person repairs a thing they have been maintaining. For so long they no longer question whether it needs to be maintained. Her eyes underneath it were a different matter. He stopped in front of her. "You told people I was happily stuck." He said it quietly, without anger, that I was content with my little operation, that I didn't belong in rooms like this one. He looked at her steadily. "Look at what Crispin was building, in your name, in the space your opinion of me left open." He let that sit for a moment. There is a difference between a man who builds quietly and a man who performs loudly. Tonight, everyone in this room saw what that difference looks like. He collected his coat, walked out through the main doors into the October evening on King Street East. The Jaguar was where he had left it. He drove home along the lakefront with the windows down, the particular cold coming off Lake Ontario at midnight. And for the first time in months, it did not feel like something to push through. It just felt like the night. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They accumulate, the way weather accumulates in southern Ontario, a shift in temperature, a change in the quality of light, and then one morning you realize something has been different for a while. The months after the gala had that quality. Crispin Vane retained a lawyer in Toronto the following Monday. The lawyer's advice was cooperative transparency, which Crispin provided in the manner of a person who has spent some time believing in his own intelligence and is now encountering its limits in a professional context. By January, he was facing charges under the criminal code and a civil action from the Foundation's board, and living in a sublet in a part of the city that did not feature in any of the stories he had told about himself. The constructed identity, the suit, the vocabulary, the practiced ease in rooms that cost something to enter had been entirely load-bearing in the architectural sense. Remove the construction, and there was nothing underneath to hold its shape. He had been performing a version of substance for so long that he had apparently stopped checking whether any actual substance remained. The Foundation was struggling. The procurement fraud had done more structural damage than the initial audit captured. 3 contractor relationships collapsed within 2 months of Crispin's termination. A significant federal grant application that had been in process was placed on administrative hold pending the investigation. By December, the interim CFO was using words like operational runway and immediate board action in the same document. Odette knew what the organization needed. She knew who had it. The divorce had been filed in November. Piers had not contested the house, not argued over the contents, not made it complicated. He had moved to a rented unit in a Victorian row house on Hess Street South in Hamilton. Tall ceilings, good light through the east window in the mornings, neighbors who waved and didn't ask questions. It suited him considerably better than the carefully curated Brant Street house had ever honestly suited either of them. The emergency board meeting was in January. 14 people, 1 item, no room for ceremony. Piers arrived in the same charcoal suit, same quiet. He placed a document on the table. Structured, specific, covering the operational shortfall with a capital injection and a 2-year restructuring timeline. Enough to protect the Foundation. Enough to protect the 31 staff members who had been peripheral to every decision that had brought this room to this particular January morning. 1 condition. Odette read it in the second page and understood it before she reached the end of the paragraph. The executive director would resign, not quietly, through an announcement carefully worded for external communications. In front of the full staff, in the main floor gathering space where the organization held its all-hands meetings. Publicly, transparently, with the same visibility that her leadership had been given during the years of success. It is worth being precise about the distinction between punishment and consequence. Punishment is personal. It satisfies the person delivering it. Consequence is structural. It addresses what was broken in the institution, not only in the individual. Piers was not interested in humiliating Odette. He was requiring that a person who had publicly performed authority and whose private decisions had been incompatible with the organization's integrity accept responsibility with the same public transparency she had applied to her success. That is not cruelty. That is accountability held to a consistent standard. Around the table, 14 people examined their documents with studied neutrality, waiting for the only realistic resolution. Odette looked at the document for a long time, then she picked up the pen and signed. The announcement was made 3 days later, 31 staff members in the ground floor space. Odette at the front in a gray blazer. No performance, no armor. She read her prepared statement in a clear voice, which cost her something visible, and when she finished, the room gave her the complicated kind of quiet that comes from witnessing something that required real courage, even courage that was compelled. Piers sat in the back row. He did not applaud. He sat with his hands in his lap and watched her with the expression of a man who takes no particular pleasure in another person's fall, even a warranted one. Psychologists call this equanimity, not vindictiveness, not forgiveness, not distance, just clarity. It is one of the harder emotional states to sustain, because most people, when wronged, want one of two things: to even the score, or to reconcile everything into something that feels better. Equanimity asks for neither. It asks only that things be what they are. Piers had been practicing it most of his adult life, though he would not have used that word. In the months that followed, Hamilton's professional community quietly redistributed itself, the way such communities do. Certain invitations changed. Certain conversations acquired new temperatures when Odette entered a room. The relationship she had built over 15 years turned out to have been more attached to her position than to her person. A discovery that most people who confuse those two things eventually make, though rarely all at once. One afternoon in late February, she drove to Lakeshore Road in Burlington and sat outside the boatyard for some time before getting out. Inside, Piers was at a workbench with a 19-year-old apprentice from Stony Creek named Tobias, walking him through the process of fairing a hull, how to feel with your hand for the inconsistencies that your eye will miss, how to let the material tell you what it needs rather than imposing what you've already decided. He was patient with it. He always had been. Odette stepped onto the concrete floor. Her boots were not appropriate for it, but she did not seem to notice, or did not care. Piers looked up. She didn't make a speech. She didn't offer an explanation, or a defense, or a reframing. She lowered herself to the edge of a workstool, and she said his name, and she said she was sorry, and there was nothing in her voice except what she meant, which is the only kind of apology that has any weight at all. Piers put down his plane. He looked at her for a long moment. "You spent years deciding I was background," he said. "Quiet, no edge in it, that I was content, that I was small enough that what you did wouldn't matter." He paused. "Look at where we're both standing right now." She had no answer. There wasn't one to have. He handed her a clean cloth, not as absolution, just as a practical gesture from a man who notices when someone needs something and provides it without making it into a moment, and then turned back to Tobias and the hull and continued the lesson. A year later, October had come back to Hamilton the way it always does. Steady, unhurried, the maples along Hess Street at full amber, the particular light off Lake Ontario in the late afternoon that makes the city look like somewhere a painter might choose. Piers Atchison was in the boatyard on Lakeshore Road, same as always, a cup of coffee going cold on the corner of his workbench, a problem to solve with his hands, a calm in him that had not been there 14 months ago. Not the calm of someone who has come out ahead in something, but the calm of someone who has found the particular ground they were always meant to be standing on. Tobias had come back for a second year of apprenticeship. He was faster now, more patient, which is the right order of development. He had also, somewhere in the past 6 months, started asking better questions, the kind that suggest a person is beginning to understand that what they don't yet know is more interesting than what they do. Piers took that as the most useful sign he could observe. The Atchison Duray Trades Bursary had placed its first 7 recipients in September, 1 in Hamilton, 2 in Burlington, 1 in Stony Creek, 3 across Niagara. Lawrence had attended the small, informal ceremony at the boatyard with the expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and finds patience, at the end, to have been entirely the right strategy. Piers had met Aurélie somewhere in the middle of all of it. Dr. Aurélie Tremblay, a marine structural engineer based in Kingston who had been commissioned by one of Piers' clients to assess the rigging specifications on a custom build, and who had arrived at the boatyard on a Tuesday morning in April, looked at his drawings, and said without particular preamble, "Your forestay attachment point is going to cause problems at anything above 30 knots of wind in a beam sea. This needs to be moved 6 inches aft. He had looked at her. You want to change my design? I want it to be safe, she said. Those aren't the same project. He had invited her back to review the full specification. She had come back, and then the following week, and then the week after that, and somewhere in those visits, between the rigging calculations and 2 dinners at a restaurant on Princess Street in Kingston, where the tables were small and the conversations ran longer than either of them had planned. Something had shifted in the way that things shift when nobody is forcing them. She never asked about the gala. She had heard pieces of it, in the way things circulate in professional circles, but she did not bring it up because she understood correctly that it was part of what Piers had been through, not who he was. Those are different categories, and she was the kind of person who knew the difference without having to be told. What she saw instead was the man who got to the boatyard before everyone else. The man who called Winifred Dow every month to check on the runabout, not because he owed her anything, but because it was the obvious thing to do. The man who, when she asked him once what he was proudest of, sat quietly for a moment and then said, "When a kid who thought he wasn't good at anything figures out he's good at this. That's the thing." She had put her glass down and looked at him directly. "You're a remarkable person," she said. "Not particularly," he said. "That," she said, "is exactly what I mean." Research in positive psychology has documented this with some care. Genuine humility, not performed modesty, but the actual absence of the need to be seen as exceptional, is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term psychological well-being. Not because circumstances are better for such people, but because their sense of who they are does not depend on circumstances. The world can rearrange itself, and they remain located. Piers Atchison had never needed to be seen as remarkable. He had needed to do good work, care for people honestly, and come home at the end of the day with something he could stand behind. That had always been enough. It had been enough the whole time. Heloise Fontaine called on Sunday evenings. She called every week without exception, and when he answered, which was every time, she asked how the work was going and listened with genuine interest to whatever he told her, and she called him by the French word for son, fiston, in the particular way of women who adopt people carefully and then keep them without conditions. He always had time. Odette was rebuilding, slowly, honestly, in the way you rebuild things when you have finally stopped arguing with the materials. She had taken a position with a smaller organization in Guelph and was working with a therapist in Hamilton whom she had initially resisted seeing for the particular reason that people who most need to see a therapist most often resist it. She was learning the difference between ambition and fear, between constructing a life and actually living one. It was hard work, the kind that shows in a person's face and bearing in ways that, if you know what to look for, you recognize as a specific kind of progress. Whether she would arrive at the destination was still being determined, but she had at least begun the journey without pretending she knew the route. On a Thursday evening in October, Piers sat on the small back deck of the Hess Street house with Aurélie beside him. The city moved at its usual pace below. Lake Ontario was visible between the rooftops in a thin, bright line to the north. The maple in the neighboring yard had gone full amber. He thought about his father, about the frozen ditch outside Sudbury and what it means to do what needs doing without an audience, about what his grandfather had built and what Lawrence had built and what he was now building, and how buildings like those do not make headlines. They make ground. They make the thing underneath that allows the visible structure to stand. He thought about Tobias, who had come in frustrated last Tuesday over a joint that wouldn't lay flat, and left calm, because sometimes the most useful thing in the world is being shown that the problem is solvable and that you have the hands to solve it. He thought about 7 bursary recipients who were at this moment learning something real. He set down his coffee. The night was ordinary in the way that good things are ordinary, quiet, specific, without ceremony, requiring no witness. He understood, genuinely content, not the relieved kind, not the triumphant kind that requires the other person to have lost. The actual kind. The kind that was built from the inside, in years of early mornings and honest work and small envelopes left without return addresses. And that does not need a room full of people watching to hold its shape. This is what the story leaves behind. The people who go quiet, who build without announcing it, who give without presenting you the accounting afterward. Look at those people carefully, because the ones making the least noise are very often the ones holding up the most weight. And if you are one of those people, if you have been doing the work while someone nearby decided that made you small, do not change, do not perform, do not shrink yourself to fit a story someone else wrote about you. Keep your hands on the work. The foundation you are laying will outlast every opinion anyone has ever held about what you are worth. The truth does not need your help. It only needs your patience.